Good afternoon to ZB listeners and all others who are interested parties. Today I'm delighted to have the Deputy Prime Minister Bill English with me to announce the remaining targets the government has set for the public sector to achieve over the next 5 years. So we'll run through the details of that announcement first and take any questions before covering off my normal ministerial activity for the week and questions on other topics. In March I announced the government had set 10 challenging results for the public sector to achieve. These results fall within 5 themes: reducing long-term welfare dependency, supporting vulnerable children, boosting skills and employment, reducing crime and improving interactions with government. Some of the specific and measurable targets that sit underneath these results have been announced over recent weeks. Today we're announcing the rest of the ambitious targets that we expect the public sector to achieve over the next 5 years. These targets are central to the government's plans to create a public service that is more innovative, enterprising, driven and focused on delivering what New Zealanders really want and expect. Delivering better public services to New Zealanders within tight financial constraints is one of the national-led government's key priorities for this term. Targets we're announcing today will help deliver on that goal. The aim of these 10 challenging results and their related targets is to get further traction on difficult issues such as reducing crime, reducing long-term welfare dependency and reducing educational underachievement. Some of these targets are very aspirational. In fact, some of them will be extremely difficult and demanding to achieve. For example, we have set 5-year targets to reduce the number of people on working age benefit for more than 12 months by 30%, or more than 20,000 people, reduce the incidence of rheumatic fever by 2/3 and reduce the violent crime rate by 20%. But I want to make absolutely no apology for having high expectations and wanting New Zealanders to get the best out of their public services. I don't want easy targets, because if they're easy targets, they aren't worth doing. This is not an exercise in ticking the boxes. I want targets that are going to stretch the ability of the public sector to deliver them, and they're going to force change. It's time for a clear focus on what will make New Zealand a better place. This is about changing the way the public service works so it's more focused and organised around delivering actual results rather than just delivering outputs. So I'll hand over to Bill, who's leading the Better Public Service reforms. He'll have a few words and we'll take any questions, and after that we'll move on to a more weekly activity.
Over the last 3 years, as we've been working through the government's spending, it's become pretty clear that in times of plenty we've got a build-up of money and programs which were effective at showing the government cared, but without much regard for whether the taxpayers' resources were actually getting results. So we've been going through a process of shifting the culture from one that focused on getting more money to a culture that focuses on getting results. It's become also pretty clear that the biggest savings we can get will come from a longer term focus on getting the right outcomes. So keeping one more teenager on the rails is going to be a low cost outcome for taxpayers. Having one more prisoner that doesn't reoffend is certainly going to save us a considerable amount of money in the longer term. So these results come out of the government focusing on getting those longer term results rather than just going into government departments and services and ripping out savings. So we want to see our government agencies working more closely together with a very strong focus on doing things that make a difference, not just doing things. So we'll want to see our social agencies working together better on supporting long-term beneficiaries into work and protecting vulnerable children. Our education agencies changing the way they do things and working together to lift achievement. And we also want to make it easier for New Zealanders, almost all of whom are ultimately customers of the government, to interact with government. We've already seen some good progress, which gives us some confidence about achieving better results. For instance, in the justice sector, where justice, corrections and police are working together, they're having an positive effect, we believe, on declining crime rates, and by the end of this year we'll actually be closing prisons, and that will be a a significant saving. We want to extend that approach across other sectors, so we're giving agencies more tools to achieve these results. And there's a program of legislative change coming through the system to the State Sector Act, the Public Finance Act and the Crown Entities Act. We'll also be making public sector chief executives accountable for achieving results, not just for managing their department or their agency on the one hand, but on the other hand giving those chief executives a bit more freedom about how they organise themselves to get better results. And we will be looking for a public service that is going to be more open to learning how to do things different ways, but also to being more adaptive, that is being able to change what they're doing when they can see that it's not working and there are some better solutions. Responsible ministers and departments are already working on fairly detailed plans to achieve these results, which will be released over coming weeks and readily available to the public. We want this to be a transparent process where progress towards these targets will be reported publicly, we would hope discussed publicly, in a way that's going to engage those hundreds of thousands of people who are involved in our public services, who can contribute to achieving these targets. And once a year we'll provide an official snapshot of progress, but it's likely people will already be familiar with progress. So it'll allow you and the rest of the country to judge for themselves just how well we are doing. We believe that these are, if we can achieve these results, then they will certainly be better for the community, safer communities with higher achieving, less vulnerable children, and we'll also have better economic outcomes as a result of that. Any questions?
Given that the public sector is far leaner than it was 3.5 years ago, are there enough people, are these goals achievable, I suppose?
Yes, we believe they are, although it's really it could be quite difficult in some cases. I mean, what gives us a bit of confidence has been the way that the public sector has responded very well to tighter resources. They have accepted that money is always going to be tight, and we're certainly seeing some good progress where they're really focused on getting results. So yeah, we have a bit of confidence about it, not to say it'll be easy, and some of these results are going to need much broader participation than just the public sector. So for instance, those that are focused on vulnerable children will require a bit more engagement from families and communities as well as government agencies, because that's actually who's looking after most of these vulnerable children.
So what will the repercussions be then if departments don't achieve their targets?
Well, look, there'll be ongoing real-time accountability. It won't just be waiting around until 2017. These will be written into public sector, public service chief executives' performance arrangements. There's designated ministers in charge of each one. That transparency, we think, is going to create the strongest accountability. I mean, in the longer run, if a department is not playing its role and doesn't appear to be focused on it, then that will be taken into account in the assessment of the performance assessment of those managers.
Will the ministers and policy be held to account though?
Oh, sorry, I'll just start here.
How do you balance that though when you say that many of the goals are aspirational compared to actually making departments get down and do it?
Well, we're not saying many of them are aspirational, we're saying these are achievable, but recognising the difficulty of achieving them in some cases, because what we're trying to do here is dig into some of New Zealand's longest running, most intractable social problems, and we're not naive about that. But there should be no doubt about the focus, starting with the Prime Minister, coming from the Prime Minister, on the need for the public service to orientate itself around actually showing gains in these result areas. And if we're not, and the critical thing is, if gains aren't being made, then we have to change what we're doing. Too often in the past, particularly in social policy, everyone knows it's not working, but the political forces and the interest groups and lobby groups prevent anything from changing. This, I think, is going to give a strong motivation for changing things where they're not working.
So
I
chief
think
executive.
one point that's worth making is on all of these 14 targets, unless we were having them specifically as targets and it was business as usual, these results would not be achieved. So essentially what the government is saying is here out in public display for every New Zealander to see is 14 of the top priorities of the government. We now are fully accountable for those and for trying to achieve those results in a very clear way. And I think that focus of the minds from ministers, from chief executives and from departments will give you better results. And we're talking about children not having rheumatic fever, we're talking about people being able to get into work, and we're talking about communities being safer. I think most New Zealanders will applaud the view that we are taking, which is a highly efficient public service, one that's performing well for New Zealanders. This isn't a question of headcount, it's about results.
But aren't they quite basic fundamentals? Shouldn't the government have been working towards that already?
Well, we do, but we obviously have lots of objectives, but I think these are ones that we've critically looked at and said, look, these are areas where New Zealand just has to do better, and we're focusing the mind of everyone can achieve a better outcome. So, I remember when we announced them, there was some scepticism about whether these were just nice, aspirational, fluffy goals that wouldn't actually mean anything. Well, you can be sure as Little Green Apples that you will be replaying this video footage if we don't achieve these targets, and you'll be holding us to account, as will the opposition, year after year. So we are taking a step and going somewhere where no previous government has gone before, and that is absolutely spelling out what we think is critically important and our goal to achieving that.
But it does say in your press release here, some of these targets are aspirational, in fact, some of them are extremely difficult to achieve. So how can you be saying that on one hand, but saying they are achievable on the other?
Well, clearly, where you're pushing the boundaries, I mean, 85% of kids getting to NCEA level 2, for instance, is a long way from where we are today. And you're talking about every percent that you go higher from current achievement rate becomes harder and harder. So there's a degree of aspiration in there. But what we are saying is that if we write it down, while they may be aspirational, while they may be hard to achieve, we also believe it's possible to do it. Now, if you take something like rheumatic fever, we're talking about effectively a 2/3 decline in rheumatic fever. Most New Zealanders would say it's a third world disease that shouldn't even be prevalent at all in New Zealand. And I'd say I agree with those New Zealanders, but I also know how challenging it is as a disease to eradicate. So there's a degree of aspiration and challenge here, but you can be sure that ministers and chief executives will be very focused on the outcomes.
Mr. English, you've said that governments don't really create jobs, that's the private sector's role, so you want to get a hold of people of long-term benefits. Isn't the private sector going to have to provide those jobs for you to do that?
Yes, that's right, and that's why this sits alongside a program which we've outlined that is all about economic policy designed to get businesses to make the decision to grow. Because in the end, a business deciding to invest a bit more and employ another person and pay a higher wage is growth. That's how it happens. So the two are complementary.
But obviously there's concerns about Europe and those sort of things means that businesses are reluctant at the moment. How much you can do about that?
Well, there's new jobs being created. Certainly a stronger economy will make this kind of goal easier to achieve. But if the economy is going to be on reasonably moderate growth, it doesn't mean we're going to give up on people who are long-term on welfare. As they point out here, there's on the job seeker, the job support payment will be something like 78,000 people who've been on it for more than a year, and that's a lot of people. So we have the choice of really focusing on shifting that number, or saying it's too hard because of what's happening in Europe. We're going for the first option.
Who's ultimately responsible for these goals? Is it the Minister or is it the CEO?
Look, I think it's a combination. From the CEO's perspective, it'll be written into their performance contract, and it'll be one of the factors that the State Services Commissioner will look at when they go about the performance review of the Chief Executive. From the Minister's point of view, again, it'll be one of the areas that I'll be holding them to account to. So I have 6 monthly performance reviews with my ministers, and it'll be included as part of that. And we'll be tracking it on a sort of real-time basis as when this information comes available. So if we're not seeing a decline in a target area of gold or an increase, depending on which target we're talking about, then we'll be asking the hard questions about why. And if you go back to Corinne's question before, I mean, the easy thing is to focus on those who've been on the unemployment benefit for a very short period of time. Typically they have better work skills, they're probably more likely to be work ready. But by going and saying, look, we're going to focus on those who've been there for 12 months or more, we're tackling tougher challenges. But if we get them into work, then we're doing great things for them and actually freeing up the overall system. So you can see we're making life easier.
So will the chief executive of Work and Income get a bonus if he or she gets 23,000 people off long-term welfare?
Potentially in part because they have mostly have a performance element as part of their contract, and this will be one of the factors that the State Services Commissioner will take into consideration.
And isn't that just going to be like encouraging the sort of ACC culture where you just sort of shoving people off, perhaps not looking at the personal circumstances?
Well, everyone can have a different view, but my view of it is there's nothing wrong with spelling out very clearly to a chief executive what your expectations are, and for there being some alignment with achieving that objective in financial performance and financial payment. So what would be wrong in the case of ACC would be if long-term claimants were being moved off their ACC compensation unfairly or inappropriately as it's spelled out in the law. The objective of wanting to move people out of long-term support from ACC is the right one, because both it's very expensive and secondly, unless it's appropriately applied, we have too many people on.
So could chief executives face pay cuts if they don't achieve the targets?
They're probably around performance, potentially yes, but like I say, it's one of the factors.
And could that then trickle down to other people within the departments?
It could do, but I mean, I think in reality what's going to happen here is we now got 14 very bright lights shining on these targets. And what is going to happen is that I suspect that the Minister, the State Services Commissioner and myself as Prime Minister are going to be monitoring what's happening there and focused on those targets, and we'll be asking the hard questions. Now, whenever you measure, monitor and report on something, you're much more likely to get better outcomes, so I'm pretty sure people will be focused.
Can you elaborate a bit on when you said public sector CEOs will be given a bit more freedom in reaching these targets? Does that mean they have more control over policy, or what do you mean by that?
Well, there's a set of legislative changes that are coming through, and what they're consistent with the approach the government's taking, and in some ways are just legislating what is the growing practice, and that is to encourage people to take a longer term point of view and to have more responsibility for the day-to-day decisions about how they achieve the results. Traditionally, the government's been locked very much into an annual cycle. Now, if you're trying to lift NCA results, from 68 to 85%, that's a long way. It entails change through the whole education system, particularly for those kids who are going to find it harder to get there. And you can't do that if you're spending 3 months of the year haggling over your budget, and someone, and no one's quite sure who's exactly making the decisions that make a difference. So the general idea is more flexibility in the system, give them a chance to take 3 to 4 year view, consistent with our 4-year budget plans, allow them to be able to move the money around with a bit more freedom, but still being accountable to Parliament, and have more operational decision making. So, for instance, if you take an area like welfare, traditionally the Minister of Social Welfare has made all the decisions about every program. Now, when you've got an $8 billion spend and you've got 300,000 people and they've all got individual circumstances, that has turned out to be not a very effective way to get the kind of change you need in real time to make a difference to people. So a few more of those decisions should be made, some of them right up at the front line actually, instead of in ministers' offices, and some of them by a chief executive instead.
There's the talk in there about the one-stop shop for business, etc. The government's been talking about that for at least 15 years. I suppose the question is, what's different this time?
Well, the difference this time is like with a lot of these results, is just the clarity of what we're trying to achieve, and and also the clarity around responsibility for it. So in that case, it's the new ministry that's being set up of Business, Innovation and Enterprise, appointed. That new ministry will be responsible for it, and the minister. Those chief executives and minister are named. That's probably the first time in 15 years that's been the case. Those ones are going to be, that one is going to be reasonably challenging because government has not been organised in a business-friendly way. The creation of the MBIE is the first step. The clear accountability is part of that, and the NBR will be watching it week by week to see whether it's actually happening.
Mr. Keith, can I ask you, the farmers have got a given TAFE approval today, 66% in favour. Is that a good positive move for New Zealand?
On the back of the happy note, we'll move on anyway. Yes, I mean, what it shows you is 2 out of 3 farmers. I think it's a good idea for a change in the capital base of Fonterra. And I think that opens a new chapter for Fonterra, being able to potentially fund acquisitions through other vehicles than solely relying on debt. It certainly solves, or may help solve, some of the problems they have around redemption risk, which have been 2 big issues for Fonterra. So, I think they'll be pleased to have a mandate now, and my understanding is they'll be moving forward, and certainly the government will be looking to progress their legislation.
There have been suggestions that they were looking for a sort of super mandate rather than just 50%. Is your understanding this is enough?
Yes, my understanding is the indications we've had from Fonterra is that 2/3 is considered to be enough. Just for what it's worth, just very quickly in terms of ministerial activity, I'm in caucus and question time Tuesday and Wednesday. Wednesday I'm in Wellington, Thursday Christchurch, and Friday I'm in Auckland. And this week in the House, the government will have the 3rd reading of the Mixed Ownership Model Bill. The remaining stages of the Prisoners, Victims Claims Amendment Bill and the Crown Entity SOE debate and the Appropriations 2011-12 Supplementary Estimates Bill. Okay, sorry.
We're running stories this morning about American research that had talked to some principals in Auckland who said that they were deliberately setting their school zones to exclude poorer areas. Is there any, would the government consider looking at the zoning the way it happens given that research?
Well, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Obviously, I'm sure the Minister of Education will look into that matter, but I mean, as it currently stands, that would be against the law. I mean, the zones are very clearly set, and if you are a parent living in the zone area, you're entitled to send your child to that school. So if a school is excluding you and you're in the zoned part of the area, then there's no reason why a child shouldn't
It's how they set the zone.
Yeah.
They're doing a zone where they're excluding poor areas where you would say that is the neighbourhood for the school.
Well, I haven't seen any evidence to support that, so we'd have to go away and look at that. And my experience with schools is generally they look at the zoned area and they're pretty supportive of what that is. They'll work alongside.
Probably just looking at the referendum on asset sales, the coalition that's put it together says you've got about 100,000 or a third of the way. What will happen if they do get there? Will you listen to this?
Well, it's got to go through a process. So the first thing is they would have to get, I think it's 10%, isn't it, to actually trigger the citizens initiated referendum to be held. If they get the 10%, of course, the referendum will be held. But I would add that they'll have to vet carefully those names. I mean, I think one of the New Zealand First members was in the House talking about how they'd had tourists signing up on the referendum. That's nice, but they're not actually eligible to vote in that. So that would need to be clarified. From there, we'll go through a process, obviously, at some point of holding that referendum if they get there. But the government spelled out its position. It's had a referendum, and that's called the general election. And we went to election 2011 with this as a policy we've been talking about since January of 2011. Labor and the Greens had it very clearly as their number 1 opposition, and we scored a record result. And even in the weekend, if you look at the Herald on Sunday's poll, while I accept it says that 2/3, 1/3 people are opposed, it also says roughly 2/3 of New Zealanders are interested in buying the shares, and it shows National's polling result above election night, which is consistent with all the other polls we've had at roughly election night. So there's a lot of light potentially in the issue, but not necessarily heat from all voters.
But do you accept that there is still a significant, potentially sort of 70%ish of people that do oppose them just on the straight? Would you support the sales or would you not?
Yeah, I think on a straight question, it's lower than that, but it's probably over half at this point. But it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the fullness of time when we go through the Mighty River Power, 49% sell down, and then the other companies.
So do you still stand by your view that you expressed that you think public opposition is waning as the process goes through?
I think they will over time, yeah. I think they'll be more supportive because in the end, if the polling is right and 60% of people want to buy the shares, then that may change their view over time. And I think, you know, when people get a chance to see those companies operating, that may also change their perspective. I mean, as I've always said, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, you've got political parties saying they're opposed, but yet none of them wanted to campaign to buy back the bit of Air New Zealand they didn't own. Labor thought that was a really good model when they were in government.
In terms of politics, I mean, you've always argued that obviously the money you get from these will be invested in schools and hospitals. I mean, will you be keen, against looking ahead to the next election, to ensure that you have got some clear investment, sort of at least term aside, that you can point to that that's where the money's going to?
Well, pretty much guarantee that will be the case. I mean, given we've set up the Future Investment Fund, we actually need that because we have a zero capital budget. We've got more assets that we want to buy, so there's argument somehow we're selling our assets. It's just not correct. We're switching assets, we're not selling our assets.
Who do you think is actually going to be able to afford the share packages? If they're starting at $1,000, how many people in the country can afford that?
Well, at one level, every New Zealander will probably own some on the basis that it's highly likely, I would have thought, that the super fund and others will buy, and they're buying on behalf of all New Zealanders. There's 1.8 million plus KiwiSaver accounts out there, and again, highly likely to participate. There's obviously a lot of retail investors that are likely to want to participate. I mean, that's obviously a matter for them and subject to the FMA legislation, but essentially, I think that's certainly going to be pitched at as many New Zealanders as possible, and the government's going to work very hard with the joint lead managers to try and make sure it's as accessible as possible to as many New Zealanders as possible.
So you think $1,000 share package is accessible to ordinary mums and dads, as you say?
Well, not every mum and dad, obviously, and some will have different priorities, and a great many people have never bought shares, but the history of Contact was it was quite a broad-ranging share option.
So what happens if this...
political repercussions at the next election at 2014 for this process, for this policy?
Well, there might be, but I mean, yeah, we went into the 2011 election with this as the clear critical policy, and I would have thought if people were really going to have a backlash, it would have been to stop us becoming the government rather than retrospective in 3 years' time. It's not like we hid it under a bushel. I mean, we came out in January of 2011, we said this is our policy. Labor's entire campaign, as was pretty much the Greens, was opposed. It was a very clear mandate, and National got the biggest polling result any political party has in MMP history.
Are you still looking at adding further share floats as part of your 2014 election policy for the next term, like beyond the 4 you've got now?
Well, we're working our way through what we've got at the moment. We said we haven't had any discussions internally about whether there's a further tranche of companies. I mean, I think what you can recognise is the ones that have been identified are the bigger entities as part of the SOE portfolio. It doesn't mean that there aren't other possible entities, but these are obviously the larger ones.
Are you confident you'll get the 5 of them sold before the next election?
I'm not 100% confident of that, no.
Are you even committed to the second one until or will you reserve judgment on that till you see how Mighty River Power goes?
Well, our aim is to do Mighty River Power well and make sure the process goes as smoothly and is as widespread, and New Zealanders are at the front of the queue, and we retain minimum 51% of all those important pledges that we've had. But we're pretty committed to working through the next and the next. But you've got there's a digestion issue. There's time. There's things we've got to get through. Some are easier than others to bring to the market.
Did you talk about Mighty River Power today?
Sorry.
Did you talk about Mighty River Power?
Not specifically, I don't think, from memory.
How would you react if the referendum result did come back against asset sales, say for instance next year? What bearing would that have, if any?
Well, it depends on when it came back, wouldn't it? I mean, for a start off, it could well come back at a time where the 3 power companies have all been brought to the market. So let's just wait and see.
And if they haven't, would you listen to it then?
Well, I think we've had a very clear mandate, and that's spelled out in the election. So, we recognise some people don't like it, but we also recognise that well over 1 million people went to the election and voted for National. Now, accept that some people that voted National would also be opposed to this policy, but they did vote for us with their eyes open about what we were going to do.
Will the bill have its third reading tomorrow?
That's my understanding, tomorrow, yeah.
Have you decided which company is coming secondly? We talked about that.
I don't know exactly, but it'll be one of the other 2 power companies.
With the timing of the referendum, obviously the government decides that, but would you consider having it, say, for instance, at the same time as the local body elections to say, on resources?
I don't think it needs to be. I mean, I think one of the previous ones was a postal vote. I think that's right. It will depend on a number of factors. I mean, obviously they've got to get the numbers first. It's got to be verification of those names on the referendum. And it would have to be held. There's a lot of water to flow under the bridge.
But you're making it pretty clear that you wouldn't change direction whatever the result of the referendum.
We've had a general election, and we've been absolutely upfront and clear about that. I think we didn't hide away, and we didn't try not to talk about this issue, and it was the number one issue, and it was all that Labour and Phil Goff and the Greens wanted to talk about, and New Zealanders voted for us in record numbers.
Yeah, I'm not looking back to the election, I'm looking forward though, okay, that won't change your view, however the result comes out.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out, but I'm just saying it's eminently possible that, three of the five would be on the market by the time you even had the vote.
Was there any discussion today about reviewing placements made under the youth justice system after the case that was led on the Ryan Investigates over the weekend? The woman that was put with a convicted rapist, opposition is saying that the 10 years where there weren't mandatory checks, those placements should be reviewed.
No, it wasn't at Cabinet. I mean, I had a discussion with the Minister on Sunday about that particular case. I mean, obviously it's historical, it goes back to 2001, and obviously it's very tragic circumstances, and clearly the government has acted in our time of being the government to changing that sort of anomaly. But there was no further discussion in Cabinet about it.
Is that something that could be considered though, because there have been placements where your time or not, there weren't checks in place. Are you satisfied that everyone made under those placements are in safe environments?
Well, you can never be 100% sure of that, but I can be sure that the Minister has moved to tighten up the previous vetting process that's used.
So you won't be looking back at any cases before this year?
I can't rule that out, but you can never take it up with the Minister.
Well, just coming back to the
new stretching of parliamentary spending to allow political parties to use taxpayer funding to gather signatures for petitions. Does the National ever do it?
Well, it might be within the law as it applies to parliamentary services. I'm not entirely sure it's in the spirit of what was intended for a citizens initiated referendum. I mean, at the end of the day, the Green Party has gone out there and hired 8 people. Yeah, I suppose it's technically right in terms of parliamentary services, but it's not really the way that I think those who would have argued a citizens initiated referendum would be held. I mean, I would have thought that's an organic process where like-minded people gather around and go and get signatories, as opposed to having a paid person, going out there and just collecting up signatures.
But who pays for your polling?
Yeah, well, we pay for quite a lot of it.
Do you think
Quite a lot, or?
Anything that's related to what's, well, we know the law obviously, but anything that's related to the areas we have to pay, we always pay, and we're quite fastidious about that.
Promise, you made some comments this morning about Mojo Matters and the funding for her translation.
Yep.
You obviously feel that all that money that the Greens are using comes out of the same pot?
Well, it does. It comes out of parliamentary services.
So you think that they should use the money that they're collecting signatures for to fund for her translation?
Well, my view is that it's important that New Zealanders understand what they're doing. They're hiring 8 people at the expense of the taxpayer to run a politically driven referendum. As long as people understand that.
There's concern being raised about mineral surveying going on here at World Heritage areas in the West Coast. What's your response to those people that are concerned with illegal mining?
I don't think people should have any concerns at all. In 2010, I spelled out very clearly that we wouldn't be going into schedule for land or World Heritage sites. The reason that survey work is being undertaken, as I understand it, is because there are many other benefits that may flow from that data collection, including geology and geological information, so they can look at faults, for instance, in the southern faults. So it's not there. It's not there for the purposes of identifying that we should be mining there.
So then why is Schedule 4 land excluded, but the World Heritage sites are?
Well, we won't. I can give you assurance we won't be mining on World Heritage sites. But what we are doing is gathering information for a variety of other reasons.
Do you think it would be a good idea to cut and scrap or reduce the duty-free allowances for tobacco?
I haven't closely looked at it. I mean, the advice I've had is that we have slightly different rules to Australia. I know they've cut theirs from 200 cigarettes, I think, to 50. and we would need to make sure that we're not in breach of our treaties and obligations. So it's a possibility, but I can't guarantee it will happen because I'd need to certainly get some advice whether we're legally able to do it.
Have you delayed the consultation process on plain packaging to await the decision in Australia from the High Court?
Not to the best of my knowledge. They were going through a discussion document on that.
Any idea when that's likely to be?
No, I'd have to ask Ariana, she's running that.
Can't you just change the law in terms of cigarettes and duty free?
No, apparently the advice I've had is there's a number of obligations, treaties and obligations for secretaries. We just have to have a look at it. We might be able to, but we're not 100% sure.
There may be trade ones, wouldn't they be similar to those that Australia is subject to anyway?
The Australian one around plain packaging is a different deal.
No, the duty-free issue.
I don't know. Just the advice I've had is while our situation is similar to Australia, it's slightly different. We just need to check that. There certainly hasn't been any discussion about that particular element, but I think everyone acknowledges it's a loophole, for want of a better term.
Those same groups are also calling on the government though to impose an even greater tax. They say 40% first up and then 20% year after year. I mean,
well, I think that's pretty tough. I mean, we've been giving a very clear signal, which is 10% a year. There's no secret the Maori Party wanted a big increase, 30-40% in the first round. We thought that was really tough on people that were addicted smokers. And part of what we're trying to do here is stop the gateway into smoking, particularly with young people. We know that price is the most effective deterrent for young people. So there's a happy balance here between, I think, sending a signal and really being tough on existing smokers.
why would we be so concerned about that, given, I mean, the debate around making prisons smoke-free and the concern that prisoners could have to go cold turkey?
It's because they're in a workplace environment and there are other people who may not want to smoke that are in that environment. Plus there are dangers, as I understand. I mean, there's always risks with cigarettes and matches.
But presumably that's gone quite successfully despite the concerns that were expressed before.
Yeah, apparently it's gone very successfully. But, at the end of the day, we live in a free and democratic country. It's not against the law for people to smoke. The government's free to put any excise tax on it wants, and it does do that to both try and deter people, so it's a form of a sin tax, but it's also a revenue collecting exercise for the purposes of higher health costs and other costs that the state may bear. It's different for someone that's in prison.
Prime Minister, on ACC, given the issues, some of the issues raised by Bronwyn Fuller and the Herald series on elective surgery, do you have any concerns that ACC is prioritising its bottom line over entitlements for claimants?
Well, I haven't seen any real evidence of that. I mean, what is clear is that John Judge came in as chairman at a time where the corporation was financially badly run, was facing a big increase in levy charges for New Zealanders, and I think he did a tremendously good job of turning that round. It's no secret that one of the big costs for the corporation is its long-term tail, and there's clearly been quite a focus on trying to reduce those number of long-term claimants. That focus should remain, in my view. It's wholly appropriate for the corporation to do that. But what is, got to be carefully monitored is that we are not throwing people off the tail, if you like, or off their support from ACC if it's not either legally correct or fair. And that's what I'm sure the new chairman and chief executive will be looking closely at.
Is it feasible that suddenly all of these thousands of people are being rehabilitated when it hasn't been possible up until now?
Yeah, because there's been quite a big increase in the tail. I mean, that was one of the things that had actually blown out over the 9 years of the then Labor government. So, if you go back to the 14 initiatives we've announced today, they're a great example where I think you will get better than business as usual results because there's quite a strong focus on it. Now, obviously, calibrating that line is something you have to do carefully to make sure that you're fair, but you get the results you want.
But the public's being asked to believe that suddenly this big increase of people who have gone off have all been because of rehabilitation and not because they've been unfairly or, that they're not entitled anymore.
Well, all I can say is if somebody believes they haven't been fairly treated, there's a series of different avenues they can explore, and in essence, Ms. Fuller is one of those who's been exploring that opportunity to express her dissatisfaction with the treatment she's been given.
You probably know yourself as an electorate MP, and certainly lots of MPs who talked about ACC, they have plenty of people who are very dissatisfied with the way they're being treated and feel they can't get anywhere or no one's listening or that they're beating their head against a brick wall. So
Yes, so it's a corporation. I think in fairness to the corporation, it deals with 1.5 million claims, I think, roughly a year. A lot of them are relatively simple cases, but some are much more complex. It does its best, I think, to try and deal with such a large number of claims fairly, but there's always some areas of disagreement. And as I've said in the past, talking about any specific case, but as an electorate MP, generally the cases of dissatisfaction I've had have been disputes over not the initial treatment that the claimant's been getting, but about the claimant's, the corporation's proposition that the person is dealing with a pre-existing condition. So what is often at dispute is whether they actually had any pre-existing condition, which they themselves may not have detected, but as a result of the accident they've then got. That's the area of dispute I see. And sometimes it's around the capacity for long-term employment.
So are you considering changes to the funding formula for ACC?
No, not in terms of fully funding the scheme. We think that's the appropriate way to go. There was a push from the corporation, as you were aware, some time ago to increase the funding from above 100%. Cabinet didn't support that view. It's possible there'll be more competition, as we've discussed in the past, but that's a little bit on hold at the moment.
Where are things at with that competition? Because consulting over the past few months, I think the target was to have something to do by the end of this month.
That's not going to be possible at the moment. The Minister, I think, is keen to look at some greater ways of providing competition, but with a new chairman and a new chief executive coming in, the number one priority has to be to stabilise the ship.
Has Cabinet actually agreed to those new board members and the chairman?
No. Haven't seen any names yet.
Given the corporation appears to have got things so wrong on privacy and the way it treats some clients and the language that they're just using dealing talking about them between themselves, do you see the potential that they might have got it wrong in other ways on entitlements, for example?
They could have got it wrong. I can't verify that on a case-by-case basis. I mean, we're talking about 1.5 million claims a year. In terms of privacy, I don't think the corporation got it wrong in so much that it deliberately tried to do something in terms of breaching people's privacy. So I don't think it got it wrong in that regard. What it's got wrong is it hasn't invested enough in its systems, and its systems are poorer, from what I can see, from other insurance companies dealing with a lot of claims. So they have been accidental breaches. Now, they shouldn't have happened and they're wrong, and the corporation's apologised and tried to deal with that in a variety of ways, but I don't think it's been, if you like, a deliberate attempt by the corporation. It's just been sloppiness caused by poor systems.
How about the manager that went back and accessed, go back to Bronwyn's, went back and accessed her case when he was told clearly to stay away from it after the language and that sort of thing? I mean, that wasn't...
You need to take, look, I've read those reports in the paper, but I can't verify they're correct, and you need to take them up with the Chief Executive or the Minister.
But there've clearly been actions that haven't been accidental or just a mistake.
They may have been if the reports are correct, but again, I can't comment on that.
Do you think it's appropriate to have the roster of Food and Grocery Council on the Health Promotion Agency?
Catherine Rich?
Yeah.
I do, yes.
Do you think there's a conflict of interest there?
I'm comfortable that she would manage any conflict.
She lobbied hard against folic acid going into bread.
She did.
And that industry has strong views about labelling and sugar and food.
Yeah.
And those are all fairly high-profile health issues. That a health ministry, if it was playing it, might want some regulations around.
They are, but it's always important the board has a range of different views.
How's that objective then?
Well, firstly, she's going to be in a different capacity there, but secondly, it's always important to have a range of different views, and the board has to take that into consideration.
Shouldn't health qualifications be the first criteria to be on an agency like that?
There may be, but again, each one of those individual components has a degree of debate that you can have about it. The debate wasn't around whether folic acid might or might not work. It was about people's rights to have that actually put in every piece of food. There's quite a difference there.